What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking the ultimate auction draft strategy, the tips and tricks you need to know no matter your experience level to succeed and ace an auction fantasy football draft. So make sure to tune in. If you enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe, let us hear it in the comment section. Anything and everything auction draft related, this is the place to ask those questions. And lastly, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. And while you're there, get yourself a copy of the 2021 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. Everything you could want at a great price. Details in the description. But with that being said, let's get right into it. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, I do want to briefly talk the basic auction draft setup and how it differs from a snake draft, because you never know the experience level of somebody watching this breakdown. And like I said before, I want this to be the ultimate auction draft experience, the one-stop shop, if you will, of everything auction draft related. So with that being said, let's begin with the difference in snake versus auction drafts. And as the majority of us know, with snake drafts, well, it's simply a round-by-round selection based on draft positioning of best player overall until you construct your roster. Simple enough. Well, in an auction draft, it puts a little bit twist to that because you essentially throw out that entire idea as you eliminate draft order. So it doesn't matter, first overall, last overall in the first round, in the middle of the first round, fifth, sixth, whatever it might be, that is no longer part of the equation. So what that means essentially is everybody can land a Christian McCaffrey. You can draft whoever your heart desires as long as you're willing to pay the price. And speaking of price, the entire idea of the auction draft is a nomination and bidding process. So you can nominate anybody that you want, doesn't matter what position, doesn't matter what player. You've got the entire player pool to choose from. You nominate said player. They have an associated average draft price, so you can use that as a reference point. And I say reference point because everybody has a certain budget that they start out with. Normally, that's $200, but it will depend platform to platform based on league settings, based on, the size of your leagues as well. So do keep that in mind. But basically, look, that's all you need to know. You've got a certain budget. You can nominate anybody you want. You can bid on anybody you want. You can get anybody you want as long as you're willing to pay the price, and draft order does not matter. Transitioning to the pre-draft process, let's begin with the idea of practice via mock drafts, because like you would expect, the more you practice, the better off you'll be for the real thing. Simple enough. But what's actually happening during this process, whether you realize it or not, is you're building out a player baseline in terms of rankings and in terms of prices. So in an auction draft, that's incredibly important because it allows you to understand whether a player is being overbid or underbid on, and therefore allows you to decide, look, I'll stay in this bidding process, okay, no problem, or I'm going to bow out because the value here associated with this player, it doesn't match up with the expensive price that his current bid is at. Again, nothing too crazy, pretty simple. But we're not done here with the idea of these mock drafts, because the big picture here has to do with the platform you're using, and specifically using the exact same platform you're going to be using during your actual draft to get your practice mock drafts on. Because here, what you're quickly going to realize is that every single platform has a different ranking and pricing system. So just because you can get player X for, let's say, $40 on Yahoo, doesn't mean you're going to be able to get him for $40 on every single other platform too. On one platform, he might go for $50. On another, he might go for $30. So just because you can put together one roster that you really like on a platform that, again, for some reason, you're using a different one than the one on your actual draft day, that does not mean you're going to be able to put together that exact same roster when it matters. Because, again, it's not a one-to-one transition. So just keep that in mind. It's a very easy fix, but if you don't realize you're doing it, it could potentially have some pretty disastrous outcomes. But let's move on now to another very important idea, maybe the most important idea here with the pre-draft process, and that is being able to understand ranks and tiers for all these players. Now, the good news is if you're saying, I don't really want to deal with ranking all these players on my own, I don't have that time, I don't necessarily have that knowledge, that's all right. Because every single platform nowadays has their own tier list, has their own ranking list. But the reason why this is so important is you need to be able to somehow identify where there is a drop off in value and production. And the best way to do that is utilizing tiers for these players to know where, the RB1s end and where the running back 2s begin. So that you can prevent the situation of not having one quote unquote stud on your team that could be a league winner, because it's much easier to have an RB1 be a league winner than an RB2 or, even an RB3. And that holds for every single position. So for that reason, be able to feel comfortable reading ranks, reading tiers. And if for some reason your platform doesn't have their tiers, just very easy to understand, a good way to kind of identify where that is happening in terms of tier breaks is kind of to see, sorted by position and look at players that are ranked close to each other. If there is a big gap in prices by like $10, $15, that's usually where there is a break in tiers. But let's continue to move on. And here I want to talk about the idea of having a backup plan if one of your players isn't available to you. And I'll equate this to a snake draft, because this happens every single year. And I've been there, you've been there, we've all been there. You're only a couple picks away from getting your dream player. You're one pick away, and all of a sudden, your league mate snipes you, breaks your heart. They draft the exact same player that you wanted one spot prior. So now, what do? Do you panic? Do you use your entire draft clock to make another choice that you ultimately aren't happy with? No. That's why you get this practice in beforehand, so you can feel comfortable having a backup plan, having, a backup to your backup even, because if option A isn't there, then go to option B, C, or even D. And I'll tie this in to, being able to understand these player tiers again, because if all of a sudden, there's a guy that you can't get, make sure that your backup is in the exact same tier. You don't want to be in the situation where, you're forced to settle for a backup that's in a lesser tier. That would be the worst case scenario. So basically, have backup options. Don't panic, because in an auction draft, you're worried about one person sniping you in a snake draft. You got to worry about the entire league sniping you in an auction draft, because theoretically they can all, get that exact same player. So as long as there's one stubborn league mate that just says, for one reason or another, I'm drafting the exact same player that you like, and I'm just going to pay a stupid amount of money to get them, well, you should just, you should bow out. You should say, all right, you can have them. The value isn't worth it. I can get somebody on that pretty similar level for a lot cheaper, and I will do exactly that. Now, continuing to move on, I want to mention the positional hierarchy. And basically what this means is understanding what positions in fantasy football are the most important. And you'll hear this pretty often for good reason. Running back is king. That's because running back is the most important position. Again, unless you're playing in like a 2-quarterback league, then it's a different conversation. But the majority of us, roster-wise, are in leagues where it's 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and a flex and some bench spots. So I'm going to mention that here. Running back is the most important position, then wide receiver, then tight end, then quarterback. There's a reason why in snake drafts in the first round you see a run on running backs, because people realize it's a position that has a pretty quick drop off, and it's much easier to get a difference maker at wide receiver, for example, in the late rounds than it is to get a difference maker at the running back position. And same situation with tight end and quarterback. Much easier to get a great starting quarterback in like the 10th round versus a great starting tight end in the 10th round. That's why people are, willing to pay up more for the tight end position. So again, simple enough. Let's continue on here with the idea of building out a team. And what I mean by this is actually, again, pretty simple. When you're doing your mock drafts, or, it doesn't even have to be during that time, just go into your specific platform, go into the settings, and see how they price their certain players. Then get a pen and paper and just do some easy math. Look, you know what your budget is. Say it's $200. You know what these players are priced for. Add, let's say $5 to that average draft price, since more often than not, you might have to overpay for some players, and then start to build out that roster. And more often than not, that'll actually give you a pretty decent idea of the type of team that you can put together. And, then come draft day, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. You're going to know what players to target, what combinations to look for, and be able to come up with a roster that maximizes the funds that you begin with. And that is a huge, huge deal. Now, next up, we're going to talk about seeing how your league mates draft, identifying their draft patterns. This has a little bit of a catch because not everybody can do it. Obviously, in order to be able to do this, you need to be in a league that's been going on for more than 1 year with guys that are consistently in that league, not one that has consistently new members every single year. And the idea here is, if you're drafting with people over and over in a league that's been going on for several years, most platforms now allow you to go into the settings again and see the previous year, what your league mates paid up for, how much the players went for. And basically, this allows you to get an edge in terms of seeing the preferences for your league mates. And you can kind of take that and warp it into an advantage for you. So you can identify maybe the league mate that pays up for quarterbacks and kind of tailor it to them. Make them spend their money at that position and put yourself in an advantageous situation later on. The last thing here I want to mention, though, with the pre-draft process, again, one of the most important things, if not most important, is deciding what strategy you want to use. Now, a quick note, I'm going to be talking about 3 draft strategies. They are the aggressive strategy, the balanced, and the conservative strategy. When we get to the in-draft process here, I simply want to point out that in an auction draft, as opposed to a snake draft, you need to know what strategy you will use prior to the actual draft. Now, in snake drafts, I say it all the time, you let the draft come to you. You don't want to pigeonhole yourself into a specific strategy where in the first round, I'm going to take a running back, same in the second round, or like I'm just going to go wide receiver in the first 3 rounds. That's the worst thing you can do. You go for value. Well, in an auction draft, it's a little bit different. And especially if you're somebody that's doing an auction draft for the first time, if you willy-nilly kind of just select players and, get these bids in place, you're going to be putting together a roster that's all over the place. I think there's going to be a lot of imbalances. There's going to be a lot of drop-off in production. It's all about how you utilize your budget. And trust me, understanding what strategy you want to use will give you a leg up on your competition. But speaking of these strategies in the draft, let's now move on to the in-draft process itself. Looking at the in-draft process, I want to specifically begin with my golden rule in regards to auction drafts, and that is simply this. When it's your turn to nominate someone, nominate the most expensive player you do not want. And why is this? Well, it's simple. I said it before, I'm going to say it again. It's all about budget management. You want to be in a position in the draft when it progresses where once it comes to a player that you actually really want on your roster, you want to have more money than your league mates. If you have the most amount of money, guess what? That means you have the best chance to land that player. You want to be in a position where you can kind of throw your weight around a little bit. You can dictate the way the bidding process goes. And the way this begins, again, is making your league mates waste their money early on. So, again, the way you do that, nominate players you don't want. During your practice sessions, you identified players that, for one reason or another, you don't like, guys that you do like. So There's always first rounders, second rounders, highly ranked guys that for some reason you think won't perform a certain way, that they're going to bust, that they're going to struggle, or that you think are just too risky and you don't want to take a chance on them. Great. That's the awesome thing about the auction draft. Just because you nominate a player doesn't mean you need to be the one that, gets them on their team. So make somebody else spend $60 right away. If you don't like Derrick Henry, if you think he's too one-dimensional, make somebody else spend $60. And just like that, you're in a much better situation than them long term. Because guess what? The more often you can do that, well, once it's, a certain player that you actually do want and they're nominated and you're going up against that league mate that you just made spend, a big amount of money a couple picks prior, you're automatically going to be in a better position if it comes to a bidding war to land the player that you actually want. So that is absolutely 100% the golden rule with these auction drafts. No matter the strategy you're using, just nominate expensive players you do not want early on. Now, also something I want to mention with these auction drafts. In the beginning, guess what? People have the most amount of money, when they still have pretty close to their starting budget, they're more likely to spend their money then because, kind of makes sense. But you're more likely to spend money when you have it. When you're down to like $50, you're probably going to be a little bit more conservative with the way you spend your money as opposed to when you have $200 and, it's still early on. That's why when people ask me, look, should I use the early parts of the auction draft to nominate a sleeper that I really, really like and try and get a good value on them? I say usually no, because in the early parts of the draft, everybody still has the majority of their funds and they're probably going to be more likely to overspend a little bit. It's not until you get to that latter part of the draft when you see the funds dwindling that you get a little bit more conservative, a little bit more cautious with how you are spending your money. So again, simple enough. Now, moving on here, I want to talk about bidding wars because it's going to happen all the time. There's going to be multiple league mates that like a certain player and that are going to drive up the price of that player. But the question is, how much should you overpay for somebody that you like? Now, I'm not going to stay here and say that you should never overbid on a player. No, that's not true. You're oftentimes going to have to overpay for top tier talent. That's just the way it is. The question is, how much should you overpay? Because, once we get past like the $5 amount of over, that average or max price associated with that player, then you're kind of getting into that territory where it's a little bit dangerous, where you could put yourself at a disadvantage later on. And again, I said it before, the name of the game in auction drafts is being able to control the bidding process. That's why it's important to maximize, the way you're spending your money, get the most bang for your buck. And if you engage in bidding wars, you're not going to be able to do that. So if you get to a point where a player is going for, let's say, $7, $8, $9, $10, if you get into the double-digit amount of dollars more than their max value, I would say get out of that bidding war. It's just a little bit too much, a little bit too expensive. That's why you've got those backups. Again, we're tying all of this together. That's why having backups is so important. You don't have to overpay for one guy. You've got multiple options. You've got an option B, C, and D. Get out of this bidding war. It's going to happen a couple times every single auction draft. It is what it is. Don't be the guy that has to overpay $10 or $15 for one player just because you got caught up in a bidding war. That's a great way to do yourself a disservice long-term when you have to construct the rest of your roster. And speaking of long-term, something that I want to mention here is understanding the idea of the max bid that you have. I feel like this is something that not a lot of people realize, but look, most of us, we play in a league where we have 15 roster spots. So what does that mean? Well, it means that at the beginning of the draft, before anybody has nominated or bid on a player, the max amount of money again, using an example of $200 as your starting budget, the max amount of money you can bid is actually $185. It's the budget that you have minus the amount of empty roster spots on your team. And again, early on, that's probably not a big deal, but when you get to the latter portion of your draft, well, then, if all of a sudden you're sitting at $50, but you still need to spend, like you need to get 10 more drafted players on your roster, then in reality, you only have $40 to spend per bid. And that could be a big deal if, again, there's a player that you really like that's a little bit more expensive, or there's a couple of players that kind of add up to that amount. So just keep that in mind. And again, every single platform nowadays has that function to track what your max bid is. Just don't lose focus of that. And again, tying this back into the whole idea of your funds, I want to quickly mention you should always maximize your funds. I said my golden rule was, nominating expensive players that you want. Well, my second golden rule would be maximizing your funds. So what does that mean? Well, think about it like daily fantasy. And here, with daily fantasy, you've got an option of players to build your team with. Well, look, if you build your roster and you have money left over, what are you going to do? You're going to go swap out one of those players for a more expensive upper echelon option and get closer to that $0 amount. Should be the exact same idea in your auction draft. You want to get as close to $0 by the end of the draft. And obviously with the most amount of, players on your roster, because you don't want to spend all of your money and have only drafted 3 or 4 players. That's setting yourself up for disaster. But, another worst case scenario is ending your draft and having like $10 or $15 left over. That is an absolute nightmare, because you know what that means? That essentially means that you could have upgraded one of the positions on your team. That could be the difference between having landed an RB2 versus an RB1. And again, that is a huge, huge deal. That could be the difference between a league-winning player versus just an average so-so contributor to your roster. That's why, look, I say it, obviously we can't all perfectly get to that $0 amount, but if you get to right around less than $5, I would say that's acceptable. But now, let's get to the point in time that everybody is waiting for, talking about the draft strategies themselves. I alluded to them. They are obviously the aggressive, the balanced, and the conservative strategy. And let's begin with the aggressive strategy itself. And as the name suggests here, you are aggressive with the way you spend, with the type of players that you get. So what I would equate this to in a snake draft is essentially having 2 first-round picks. And what that means is, probably getting 2 top 5 guys. So getting like a Alvin Kamara and a Ezekiel Elliott. You wouldn't be able to do that in a typical snake draft. But in an auction draft, if you're willing to pay the price, if you're willing to pay top dollar, then you can do that. The question is, what's going to happen afterwards? Because, look, we can all spend money early on. That's the easy part of the auction draft. The tough part is then constructing a good remaining roster without too many holes, without too many drop-offs, one that can compete on a week-to-week basis. And this is one of the potential downfalls of an aggressive strategy. I always want to point out the pros and the cons. Well, the con is you put yourself behind the 8 ball in how you construct the rest of your roster. You're probably not going to have the greatest depth, and if you suffer some unlucky injuries, you could be in for a long season. And that's why usually I don't necessarily recommend being very, very aggressive for beginners in auction drafts. But if you do feel comfortable with it, well, it's a high risk, high reward type of situation, because usually, again, teams that make a push for the playoffs and for the championship, you'll see that they have several, definitely at least one guaranteed stud on their team. But the more studs you have on your team, the better chance you have at being a better team overall. But again, it's not as simple as that, because your starting roster is not going to be just carried by 2 players. That's why, again, it's a long-term type of play. And with the aggressive strategy, you're going to be spending a lot of money to begin with and then waiting a long period of time and then getting back into the bidding action. But again, my takeaway message, if this is your first time playing the auction draft format, maybe don't be on that extreme side of the aggressive strategy. Get some practice with it and see if you like it. But now let's talk about the conservative strategy, the other spectrum of the extreme. And with the conservative strategy, what's nice here is, yes, you are waiting until probably a lot of picks have been made. So again, in a snake draft, I'd probably kind of compare this to starting your roster construction in like the third round, but then getting like 3 third-round picks, four third-round picks, something like that. So what essentially happens in a conservative strategy is you might not have that league-winning type of talent, but you have, bar none, the best depth on your in your league. You've got probably the best bench as well, which again can be important if there's injuries, and you've got very little, if any, type of drop off between positions. All your guys might be like RB2s and wide receiver 2s, but you're not going to go from like an RB2 on your team to all of a sudden, like an RB4 or something like that. You're pretty much going to have RB2s, wide receiver 2s across the board. So a lot of consistency there, but you might struggle in terms of getting upside in scoring. That's why, again, unless you're somebody that's really experienced, I would stay away from the conservative strategy because it can also backfire on you. One of the, I would say, the biggest cons across all these strategies, but here specifically with the conservative strategy, is if you decide to wait a while and somebody else also decides to employ a conservative strategy, and then you get to that point where, there's a drop off in tiers and you're both battling for that exact same player, what can inadvertently end up happening is you guys end up driving that bid to an extremely high amount, to the point where, if you land that player, you might be paying the exact same amount it would have cost to actually get an upper echelon player to begin with. And again, that would be the worst case scenario. That's why it's a little bit tough to commit to the conservative strategy. Don't get me wrong, it works really well if you're the only one using the conservative strategy, but if there's more than one person using that strategy, then it can get bad. So again, make sure to know the pros and the cons with all these strategies. And lastly here, I want to talk about the balanced strategy. And as the name suggests, you're somewhere in between aggressive and conservative. In a snake draft, I would just compare it to a typical snake draft. You've got a first round pick, a second round pick, a third round pick, a fourth round pick, so on and so forth. So, you're getting one stud and then maybe like a second slightly lower echelon player, and then a little bit lower, then a little bit lower, but you don't have major drop-offs. But at the same time, this is the problem with the balanced strategy. You're not necessarily taking advantage of the whole auction draft format itself, because that way you might be ignoring guys that are going for really, really good values that are upper echelon players. And again, usually what happens in the later rounds of auction drafts, the longer and longer you wait, the better deals that come up. So if you spend a little bit more money early on and then are patient, what I have found is that in the later, portions of that auction draft, you can get some really, really good values, discounts on players that might be like $5, $10 less than their average price. So then it probably doesn't come as a shock to you when I say the strategy that I would recommend is probably somewhere between an aggressive and a balanced strategy. If you want a firm answer, probably more so towards the aggressive strategy, just because, again, when it boils down to it, you need those studs on your team. And sure, having depth is awesome. And if you're conservative, it can be great. You can have the best bench ever. But you can also be in a situation where then you're wondering on a week-to-week basis, well, damn, what guy should I start here? What guy should I start there? I have so many options. I don't know who to start. And you're always going to have a situation when you just leave a high score on your bench, and that's one of the worst feelings. At that point in time, sure, you've got depth, but, what good is depth if you can't, play all those guys at the same time? And you usually can't unless there's injuries. And again, you can't rely on injuries. So for that reason, I would suggest, something in between aggressive and balanced, but closer to aggressive. But with that being said, we wrap up this breakdown of the in-draft process and the overall, ultimate auction draft breakdown. And hopefully you guys were able to take something away from this, regardless of your experience level. If you guys have further tips, let me hear it in the comment section. This is the place on YouTube to talk auction fantasy football drafts. No other channel does these breakdowns like we do. Make this the place to discuss your strategies and your tips and tricks for these auction drafts. Add to our already existing list. And again, if you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe, and in the meantime, we'll see you guys in future videos.